So Angular 14 was recently released, and with that release came this concept of standalone components, otherwise known as optional modules. From what I can see, standalone components don't fundamentally change the way an Angular application works. More so, it's an improvement to the developer ergonomics of the way components can be configured. So I haven't done a whole lot of Angular lately, so I wanted to dive in and play around with this concept in the new Angular 14. And I created this plate weight calculator. And what it does is total the poundage that's loaded onto a piece of gym equipment. So if I wanted to do barbell bench press, for example, I could come in here and I could set a base weight of 45. An Olympic barbell is 45 pounds typically. And then maybe I want to throw a couple of 45s on each side. So now we have 135 pounds. And let's go ahead and throw a 25 on each side, 185 pounds. Now let's say we're trying to bust through our plateaus here and just increment that weight ever so slightly. We're going to throw a 2.5 on either side. Now I have 190 pounds. And what you can see is that as I'm doing this, I'm actually storing the state of this plate weight calculator in the URL fragment so that if I refresh, I actually get the same information rendered to the UI so that I can now send this to someone else and we can have an interesting and fun conversation about plate weights as you normally do. So let's take a look at what is going on under the hood. So if we jump into our main TS file, and this is the file that's responsible for bootstrapping the application, what you'll notice immediately is that there is no application module to speak of. I'm simply importing the app component, and then I'm bootstrapping that component. Now, because this is a relatively simple application, I don't have much in the way of providers. If I had to do something like configure routes for the application, I could pass in an optional configuration object that had a providers collection. But again, this is a relatively simple app, and I can explore the use of standalone components without having to get deep into the weeds of providers. So let's take a look at our app component, because that's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. In our app component, we still have our component metadata, but you'll notice that I'm defining this as a standalone component. And what that tells Angular is that this component can consume other standalone components. Now, it also allows us to do a very exciting thing, which is to import a component right here at the top and then provide that as a declaration to be found in the template for this component. So historically, what I would have had to do to make the meter component available inside of the app component is I would have had to create a parent module and then provide both the meter component and the app component as declarations. But now we can start to use that more React-inspired, Vue-inspired, I'm pulling my component in the top and then using it immediately. And there wasn't the sense of boilerplate for the modules that we've had historically. Now, because I don't have that boilerplate, it means that things like the common module and the forms module haven't been provided anywhere, which means that if I want to use core directives like ngIf and ngFor and ngModel, I actually have to import those at the top and then import them into this standalone component to tell Angular that all of the directives provided by these modules might be consumed within my app component template. Now, there's a bunch of logic here for adding and removing plates. None of that is particularly relevant to the standalone component concept, so I'm not really going to look at it. But I will say, again, that we're including this meter component, and we're also including injecting a URL state service, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's first take a look at this meter component. So I mentioned that by denoting this as standalone, we can consume other standalone components, and meter component is another standalone component. And if we jump into it, you can see it does the same thing. It defines the component as being standalone, and just as with the app component that we were looking at, it has to import the common module and then import it into its own component so that the meter template can use the core directives like ngIf and ngFor of, which is actually what I'm using the ngFor of. You can see right here, ngFor of reading of readings. But the templates are not really interesting, so I'm going to stay away from those. And the reason that we have to include the common module in this component as well as in the app component is because that's what the standalone component is doing, is it's localizing the components and their component associations and their component usages and wiring up various components. This is what the module would have historically been doing, but because we're bypassing the module, we now have to be more explicit in what we want to make available to our templates. I think we can still just rip these out and actually put these in the Bootstrap application. I think we could put that in our providers. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't actually tested that because I wanted to look at the whole imports. But let's jump back now to our app component for a second, and let's just look at our URL state service. You can see I'm injecting that as a constructor dependency. And if we look at the URL state service, there's literally nothing here that's actually been changed by the concept of standalone components. I'm still including my injectable. I'm still decorating my service as an injectable. I'm still providing it into the root. And now apparently injector containers are called environment injectors. So this is still going into the root, which is what makes it available to every component within the application. And there's nothing here that's affected whatsoever. So again, the standalone component isn't really fundamentally changing the way the Angular application works. It's really just a developer ergonomics change. It's I want to import a component and use it locally change, right? The application still basically works the way it has worked for the last 6 or 7 years. It's more just changing where those configurations exist, and it's beginning to co-locate more of the configuration with the components that depend on that configuration. And again, this is just my first time looking at this, so I'm by no means a seasoned expert here. This is my first usage of standalone components, and that's why I don't want to get too much into the details because I'm sure I will only mess it up. But anyway, I had fun building this, and I just forgot how much I love Angular, and I think it's a fun little UI. I'm actually going to use this later when I'm working out. So enjoy your Monday.